Sunshine by day, chilly mornings, especially so in the south, and some stubborn fog patches as well. Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 a.m. this Thursday morning, and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on both your TV and your radio. Now, fast-paced news this morning following the Prime Minister's Partygate apology yesterday, as the Prime Minister has pulled out of a visit and his Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jonathan Van Tam, has announced he'll be leaving his role. 3 Tory MPs are calling for the Prime Minister to go. We'll have all of the latest news and analysis for you today after the headlines with Rosie Wright.
A very good morning to you. It is 9:33. I'm Rosie Wright in the GB News newsroom. Let's get you up to date. Boris Johnson is facing growing calls to quit as Prime Minister from some senior Conservative MPs. Among those demanding his resignation is the Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross. The Prime Minister apologised yesterday for attending a bring-your-own-booze party in the Downing Street Garden in May 2020 when the country was in lockdown. Well, Mr Johnson has pulled out of a planned visit today to a vaccination centre due to, he says, a family member testing positive for coronavirus. England's Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jonathan Van Tam, is leaving his role at the end of March. He's been one of the key scientific figures during the coronavirus pandemic and was recently knighted in the New Year Honours List. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, tweeted it was an honour to work with him. The Duke of York faces the prospect of giving evidence in court later this year in New York. It's after a US judge threw out a motion to dismiss a civil sex abuse case against Prince Andrew. The judge ruled that a 2009 agreement between his accuser Virginia Giuffre and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein didn't extend to the prince. Ms Giuffre is suing Prince Andrew over claims he sexually assaulted her when she was 17, 2 decades ago. The Duke of York denies all allegations. The tennis player Novak Djokovic has been included in the Australian Open first-round draw, despite Australia still considering cancelling the player's visa. The Serbian was drawn against his fellow countryman Miomir Kecmanovic in the first round. A decision from Australia's immigration minister on whether the world number 1 can stay in the country is not expected until Friday. Now, a rare Roman wooden figure has been found in a waterlogged ditch in Buckinghamshire. The well-preserved ancient artefact was discovered by workers on the HS2 project. It's carved from a single piece of wood and experts think it's almost 2,000 years old. You're up to date here on TV, online and DAB Plus radio on GB News. Right now to the briefing and Tom.
Good morning, it's 9:35 this Thursday morning, and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, Boris Johnson is facing the biggest challenge of his premiership. 3 of his own MPs are calling for him to resign. Long-standing backbencher Sir Roger Gale, Constitutional Affairs Committee Chairman William Wragg, and Scottish Conservative Party leader Douglas Ross. This is what Douglas Ross had to say yesterday afternoon.
The Prime Minister attended this gathering party event in Downing Street on the 20th of May, then he could not continue as Prime Minister. So regretfully, I have to say that his position is no longer tenable.
Now, the Prime Minister spent much of yesterday effusively pressing the flesh in the House of Commons tea room, something he hasn't felt the need to do since the last leadership election 2.5 years ago. And this morning, Boris has pulled out of a planned visit to Lancashire due to, according to Downing Street, a family member testing positive for coronavirus. Of course, Prime Minister's questions was a bruising affair for Boris Johnson yesterday, whose carefully worded almost apology over those Downing Street mid-lockdown drinks did little to quell the opposition. The Prime Minister maintains that he did not think the event was against the rules, but apologised for the impression the event gave. Well, Sir Keir Starmer and a host of opposition MPs immediately demanded his resignation. Well, why don't we talk to one of those Labour MPs this morning? Graham Stringer is the Labour MP for Blackley and Broughton and can join me now. Welcome to the programme, Graham. First of all, the Prime Minister apologised yesterday. Do you think that will go to any length to shore up his position?
In this country, normally when people apologise, it's natural to accept it. I think there are 2 things about this. One, it was a half-hearted apology, which he came into the tea room afterwards and said it wasn't really his fault. So, like a lot of things the Prime Minister says, sadly, it's not believable. But the issue of which he made his half apology is so serious. People in the country were unable to see dying relatives. He'd set the rules about what you could and couldn't do, and he's broken them. So he's broken his own rules, he's telling people to do something he's not prepared to do. That's hypocritical. But almost as important as that, I had my doubts right the way through that there was any science that said it was dangerous going in the open air. People in Derbyshire were chased with drones for walking along empty valleys. People were moved off park benches on Merseyside, in Brighton, in the middle of sea breezes. So some of the things that he'd introduced weren't necessary. And that party in Downing Street shows that he knew it.
I myself was told to get off an open stretch of grass in the first couple of weeks of that lockdown. Living in a flat with no garden, that was quite extraordinary to me. I'm sure many people have some of those less serious examples as well. Although I suppose also during that week, of course, this was 2 months into the lockdown, there had been one step of easing. You were allowed to meet one friend outdoors, socially distanced by the point of the 20th of May. That week we did see a number of viral photographs of full beaches, of socialising during that very, very sunny week. I wonder if, in your opinion, those sort of photographs might have influenced the behaviour of those making the decisions.
Might have influenced the behaviour of what? I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Might have influenced the behaviour of those who attended the party, seeing those crammed beaches that week.
They may well have done. But the fact is, this was the hub of the country's decision-making machinery. They had been condemning people for going on beaches. The police had been enforcing the rules as they had been laid down at other beaches, in parks and all sorts. People were moved on from sitting on park benches. But in a sense, it's not those details. It's the fact that the Prime Minister was telling the country to do things and not doing it himself. And I'm afraid it's not the first time he's been caught out either lying or being hypocritical. And he does, I'm a Labour MP. It's part of my core business to criticise the government and show when they're failing. But at the same time, I'm British and I want this country to do well. And it does this country no good to have a Prime Minister who nobody can trust because he's regularly told porcupines.
Now, a couple of months ago, your party leader, Sir Keir Starmer, was asked if he would call for the Prime Minister's resignation over another matter, and he said that he wouldn't because he didn't think that the Prime Minister would accept his advice. Now your party leader, as of yesterday, is calling for the Prime Minister's resignation. Does that mean he thinks that he will accept his advice now?
Well, the Prime Minister's hiding behind an inquiry he's set up, carried out by an official who is responsible to him. So while I'm sure she's got integrity, it's very difficult for somebody who's employed by somebody else to come to a really harsh decision on it. So there's going to be a wait. I don't think the Prime Minister will voluntarily resign, but I think he may well, in the course of time, maybe after the May elections, be forced to resign by his backbenchers. So it's part of the normal dance of politics. I was in the chamber yesterday when the Prime Minister made his half apology, and although the government backbenchers, they had masks on, you could tell they were silent and looking glum, almost to the point of self-harm. There's not a lot of support left in the Conservative Party for him. They're making calculations about who would be best to replace him and whether their electoral chances would increase. But he's effectively a political dead man walking now.
That is a striking phrase there. In your assessment, then, the most likely time that the Tory MPs may make a move on the Prime Minister is in May.
Yeah, he's there. A lot of the Tory MPs have never liked him. They've never liked his lifestyle. They've never liked the way he approaches politics. But they've tolerated and supported him and benefited from him because he is one of the greatest campaigners the Conservative Party have ever had. There is no doubt he reaches parts of the electorate, or has reached parts of the electorate, that other Conservative MPs can't. So if the first test of his electoral appeal, whether it's remaining, is the local elections in the first Thursday in May, if he fails that, I think that those people who never supported him, and those people who supported him because he's a proven winner in referenda, in the London mayoralty, in a general election, if that magic has gone, then I think that's the time when he will be most vulnerable.
Fascinating analysis there. Graham Stringer, thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really, really interesting conversation. Let's move this conversation forward now. Joining me are two journalists, freelance writer Sabrina Miller and news editor of the Conservative Home website, Henry Hill. Welcome to the programme, both. Let's start with you, Henry. Really quite torrid front pages across the press this morning. Can the Prime Minister find any way to bounce back from this?
I wouldn't have thought so at this point. Christmas was it. You know, the hope of the Conservative Party was that this story, having dominated December, if he made it through the Christmas period, he didn't impose lockdowns over Christmas or New Year. They hoped that he'd get credit for that because it does seem to have been the right decision. And then in January, we could pivot back towards talking about what the party wants to be talking about, levelling up, trying to deliver for those voters who lent their vote to the government in 2019, having never voted Conservative before, many of them, and who want to see the government deliver for them. Instead, here we are halfway through January, neck deep in this story. We don't know, the Conservative MPs don't know whether or not there's going to be more stuff that comes out, because we didn't know this email was there until it was leaked to the press. So it's incredibly difficult to see how he comes back, because Boris Johnson, the whole point of Boris Johnson, as the previous speaker was just saying, was that he had that magic touch. He had the ability to connect with people, to reach out to people who don't normally consider voting Conservative. I do think that magic touch has probably gone now, and I don't see how he has an opportunity to get it back.
And Sabrina, let's turn to those 3 Conservative MPs who've so far publicly called for the Prime Minister to resign. At least one of them, a fairly significant figure, although Jacob Rees-Mogg last night was suggesting that Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, isn't particularly significant. Is this creating a real rift now between the Scottish Conservative Party and the United Kingdom's Conservative Party?
I mean, quite possibly. I actually think there are now 4 MPs that have called for Boris to resign. I think Caroline Noakes as well indicated last night that she would support for him to go. And with Jacob Rees-Mogg's comment last night, there certainly is going to be a lot of tension. But if Boris Johnson does resign and Douglas Ross made the right call, then that will possibly do wonders for the union and sort of show the strength of the Scottish Tories. So it's all to be seen.
That's interesting. I suppose, Henry, you're someone who cares deeply about the union. Jacob Rees-Mogg last night saying that Alistair Jack, in Scottish Secretary, was much more important than the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party. In your view, is that a line that could possibly hold?
I mean, important in what sense? Both Douglas Ross and Alistair Jack have very important but very different jobs. I think it's faintly ridiculous for it's perfectly acceptable within the Conservative Party for people to attack the leader. Boris Johnson, of all people, has to concede this because he spent so long doing it to Theresa May. Douglas Ross is a part of the Conservative Party. He leads a section of the Conservative Party, and he is also a member of Parliament who has as much right as any other member of Parliament to express his views about the Prime Minister and indeed to write to the 22 Committee. And I think it's really unfortunate and short-sighted that those seeking to defend the Prime Minister, which is their prerogative, have tried to do it by belittling his position, because fundamentally, Douglas Ross inherited the leadership of the Conservative Party, of the Scottish Conservatives, from Ruth Davidson, one of the more extraordinary campaigners that the Conservative Party has seen in recent years. And in the most recent Scottish elections, he managed to hold ground, deny the SNP their majority, and maintain that historic Scottish Conservative performance at the Hollywood elections. So I really don't think that colleagues in London, who owe him a debt, because if the SNP had won a majority, the government would have a face-off with the SNP to deal with on top of everything else, should be treating him in such a cavalier fashion.
No, it's very, very interesting. Moving back to the Westminster specifics, the intricacies, the tea rooms even. Yesterday, we were hearing that the Prime Minister was, for the first time in a long time, walking around those tea rooms, pressing the flesh, almost as if there's a leadership election going on right now. Sabrina Miller, in your view, does the Prime Minister have a hope of winning over these MPs who, many of them potentially owe him their jobs, but don't feel that much loyalty towards him right now?
Things in the Conservative Party are incredibly tense, especially when it comes to the 2019ers. I personally think that Boris will survive this. It would be incredulous to me if someone that has won an 80-seat majority lasts less time than Theresa May did. So I think he's really working the room, but I suspect possibly, unless, depending, of course, on the Sue Gray investigation and if further Christmas parties emerge, I think the worst is possibly over after the horrendous PMQs that he had to endure.
If this is really the case that the worst is behind him, what's going to happen when this report comes out, in your view, Sabrina? When finally we see all of these details, and they'll be very plain, an independent civil servant, of course, Sue Gray, putting forward those details in a very plain fashion, that's going to be pretty difficult to weather.
No, 100%. This is all pending the Sue Gray investigation, as sort of I prefaced before, because it's hard to know sort of what she'll come out with, and she is very independent-minded, and I'm sure her investigation will be incredibly thorough. But she can't force him to go. She's going to just sort of lay out the facts, and it will be interesting to see what she comes up with. And depending on the investigation and the report will depend on Boris's future. But I think that he's possibly moved past the worst of it.
Interesting. Well, one of the points that people were pointing to yesterday, of course, was that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was not to be seen on the front bench. Of course, the leading contender, according to many betting markets, to replace Boris Johnson. Henry Hill, just exploring how those two potentially favoured candidates to replace Boris Johnson, were this to go to a leadership election, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, responded to this scandal. How do you analyse that situation?
Well, Liz Truss was slower than some of her colleagues to support the Prime Minister, but she did end up giving him much more full-throated support than Rishi Sunak. And it's interesting because that suggests they're taking very different approaches, and we don't exactly know why that is. It might be that Truss is simply much warier than Sunak about being perceived to wield the knife. That's always something that tends to worry frontrunners in Conservative leadership contests, because the classic saying, he who wields the knife never wears the crown. But another intriguing possibility is simply that Rishi Sunak didn't intend to be the only senior member of the cabinet not to support the Prime Minister. One of the criticisms levelled at him by people who are sceptical of his leadership ambitions is that whatever you think of his policy prospectus, his political antennae aren't always very good. And it might simply be the fact that he expected more of his colleagues to put some blue water between themselves and the Prime Minister, and is a bit surprised this morning to find that he has inadvertently put himself out on a limb.
Very, very interesting there. Well, this will no doubt roll on for the days and weeks ahead. But for now, Henry Hill and Sabrina Miller, thank you very much for joining us on The Briefing. Fascinating analysis there. Well, it's not only Tory leadership that has been going on this week. The government has also announced plans to place a legal duty on event venues to put in place security measures aimed at protecting the public from terror attacks. New regulations are planned to befall any place with a capacity of over 100 people to which the public has access as of right or by virtue of express or implied permission. Well, the announcement has been welcomed by campaigners for what has become known as Martin's Law, named after Martin Hett, who was tragically killed at the Manchester Arena attack in May 2017 alongside 21 others. Now, while some campaigners say this law is necessary to keep people safe, others argue it's yet another barrier to doing business and living freely in the UK. More inspectors, more regulations to guard against what is statistically a very low risk. Well, let's talk now to someone who's written about this proposal and contributed to some of the process in analysing it. Let's talk now to Archdeacon of London, Luke Miller, who can join us on The Briefing this morning. Welcome to the programme. First of all, can you set forward exactly what this proposal would mean for venues up and down the country?
Well, thank you. First of all, I mean, it's got to be right, and it would mean for all venues that we have to think clearly about public safety and make sure that we are taking into account the fact that the world has some pretty dangerous people in it. And of course, Martin Hett, amongst others, was tragically and terribly killed in that attack in Manchester. And we don't want things like that to happen, and we need to take steps to try to make sure that they don't. And we've been very grateful for the way that the consultation has taken into account the concerns that have been raised, however. The serious concerns that there are some unintended consequences for the way that the proposed legislation was first of all set out, because it would be very wide in scope, taking in a great deal of venues and buildings, including almost every church in the land. And it would also have a degree of cost, because there would be a duty, as originally set out. The idea was that every church should, or every venue should have a clear event manager, staff who are trained in counter-terrorism, and add to their risk assessments a raft of extra assessment that would possibly also require further cost, because insurance companies and training organisations are very quick to say, well, here, we can help you with this. And disproportionate costs then coming to largely volunteer-run organisations, coping with another raft of over-complex requirements. And so in scope, cost and complexity, we need the proposals to remain proportionate. Very grateful to see that there is some steps in those directions in the response document to the consultation. There's now a stage in which the impact is assessed. We need to make sure that that impact assessment goes really well and takes into account the realities of the situation on the ground for lots of volunteer-led organisations, including churches.
It's very interesting because, of course, everyone rushes to say that, of course, we should do more to protect people from terrorism. But then when we look at the particulars, and particularly the impacts on churches, volunteer-run organisations, or indeed the hospitality industry, which has come under so much stress over the last 2 years, placing so many more burdens, duties and costs upon many of those venues. I think one of the initial problems with this legislation is it would have asked all nightclubs to train every single person who worked in a nightclub in anti-terrorism training. It seems like an enormous burden to place on businesses when the risk of being caught up in an awful event such as a terror attack is incredibly low in this country.
Yeah, I don't run nightclubs myself, but you're right. The concern that we have in churches and faith organisations is that where we are largely led and run by volunteers, and we need to make sure that that there is a proposal that everybody has full-on training. And so does the person that comes to open up St Agatha's by the Gasworks in the morning on a voluntary basis so that it can be open to the public? And again, there's another aspect to this, which is that churches specifically have an ethos of openness. I've often said that they're not to be seen like office blocks with a scan thing at the front door where you have to sign in, but much more like a park with a roof on the top, places that are by their very nature open to the public, and quite deliberately actually take the risks that go with that. And we therefore need to make sure that things are proportionate. We mustn't be cavalier, but we do need to be proportionate. And so working out what level of training is really needed, what the risks really are, and how we might then mitigate them. And the danger, of course, is that our society tends to run towards maximum mitigation. And something I've written is to say that if we are in a place where government, through the duty that is then imposed, leads us to the point where we say, well, actually the best way to deal with this is simply to close, leave the doors locked, then we will have given the terrorists an extraordinary win. Not deliberately, but unintentionally. We will have said to the terrorists, we've been frightened into closing our churches down. That's to give an extraordinary win unnecessarily, in my view. And we need to make sure that therefore the duty is structured in a way that is really properly proportionate. So one of the things that's in the response document, which is very helpful, is to say that instead of saying what is the absolute capacity of a building, because most churches in the land do seat more than 100 people, is to say what's the average numbers of people going. If you've got an enormous wool church in a country area in the east of England, where there's huge wool churches as to be found, but serving villages whose entire population could fit into the building, should they have the same duty imposed on them as a busy nightclub in central London? Yeah. Probably not. So we need to make sure it's proportionate.
No, it's a fascinating area. Archdeacon of London, Luke Miller, thank you very much for your thoughts there and for that comparison between churches and nightclubs. Not one that I had made before, but potentially venues that people rely on very greatly indeed. Thank you very much for joining us on The Briefing this morning. I'm afraid that's all we have time for in the programme. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick and Anaya, but first, here's the weather.
Good morning. A cold one out there again across the south this morning with a frost for many. Not quite as cold further north. There is more cloud around, but for many it's going to be a sparkling day of winter sunshine, courtesy of this area of high pressure that's been moving in over the past day or so and is set to stick around for at least another couple of days. There are more isobars on the chart across Scotland, suggesting it